Across cultures and eras, there is a recurring psychological compression that appears whenever stability is prolonged. Vigilance recedes, defensive postures soften, protective reflexes, once necessary for survival, are gradually reclassified as unnecessary, even obstructive. What remains is not recklessness, but confidence, a quiet assumption that certain threats no longer require attention because the environment itself has become trustworthy. This condition is not framed as danger. It is experienced as progress, as social maturity, as evidence that earlier fears have been outgrown. Protection, once visible and deliberate, becomes implicit, embedded, unspoken. The system appears safer precisely because its defenses are no longer consciously engaged. Trust in this sense is not merely relational, it becomes structural. And when that occurs, self-protection does not vanish through force or failure. It is retired through belief. Historically, self-protection has rarely been treated as a psychological virtue. It is associated with suspicion, fragmentation, and the erosion of social cohesion. Many philosophical and moral traditions have positioned trust as the antidote to these outcomes, a necessary lubricant for cooperation, trade, intimacy, and institutional stability. In early human communities, trust functioned as a risk calculation. To trust was to accept exposure in exchange for belonging. Protective behaviors remained intact, but selectively suspended within defined boundaries: kinship, ritual, oath, reputation. Trust did not eliminate defense. It negotiated where defense could be lowered without catastrophic cost. Modern social systems altered this balance. As institutions replaced kin networks and procedural safeguards replaced interpersonal assessment, trust was gradually redefined. It became less about selective exposure and more about generalized expectation. One no longer trusted specific individuals or contexts, but the system itself. This shift reframed protection. Self-protection began to appear redundant, where rules, norms, and enforcement mechanisms were assumed to operate continuously in the background. To remain guarded in such environments was no longer interpreted as prudence, but as maladjustment, an inability to recognize stability when it had arrived. Trust, then, evolved from a situational posture into an ambient condition. Within this environment, a particular interpretation gained traction: that sustained trust is evidence of psychological advancement. According to this view, vigilance belongs to earlier, harsher conditions. Mature systems, social, organizational, or relational, are thought to render constant self-protection unnecessary. This interpretation does not claim that harm is impossible. Rather, it assumes harm is improbable enough to be deprioritized. The defensive self is reimagined as a relic of scarcity thinking, replaced by a posture of openness aligned with modern ideals of transparency and cooperation. Notably, this framework does not present itself as belief. It appears as common sense. Trust is not adopted, it is inherited. Individuals raised within stable institutions do not decide to lower their guard. They simply never learn to maintain it. Psychologically, this interpretation compresses agency. Protection becomes externalized, delegated to norms, contracts, surveillance systems, or reputational consequences. The individual's role shifts from active boundary maintenance to passive participation within an assumedly protective environment. Importantly, this is not naivete. It is alignment. Trust is framed as synchronization with a system that promises to absorb risk on behalf of its members. Classical social contract theories often implied this transition without resolving its psychological implications. While thinkers such as Hobbes emphasized protection as the primary function of collective order, later interpretations soften this emphasis, treating security as a stable background condition rather than an ongoing exchange. What remains unresolved in these frameworks is the fate of individual protective capacity once trust becomes ambient. The theories account for obedience and legitimacy, but not for the atrophy of self-defensive cognition when protection is no longer rehearsed. This omission becomes significant in environments where trust persists longer than the conditions that originally justified it. The first cost of this interpretation is not vulnerability, but displacement. Self-protection does not disappear, it relocates. Instead of being practiced consciously, it is absorbed into systems whose functioning is no longer directly perceptible. This displacement alters identity. Individuals no longer experience themselves as agents responsible for their own boundaries. Instead, they occupy roles within structures presumed to enforce those boundaries automatically. Psychological safety becomes an attribute of the environment rather than an activity of the self. Agency follows a similar trajectory. Decision-making shifts from anticipatory to reactive. When protection is assumed, early warning signals lose relevance. Threat recognition is delayed not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer cognitively prioritized. Relationships are also affected. Trust without active self-protection reshapes intimacy. Disclosure becomes expected rather than chosen. Withholding is reframed as opacity. The line between openness and exposure blurs, not through coercion, but through normalization. At a deeper level, psychological coherence changes. The self becomes organized around continuity rather than contingency. Adaptation slows. Protective instincts, once refined through repeated calibration, remain undeveloped or dormant. When stressors emerge, the individual may experience not fear, but disorientation. The internal question is not, how do I defend, but why was defense necessary at all? This disorientation is often misread as trauma or betrayal. In many cases, it is neither. It is the result of an interpretive framework that rendered self-protection psychologically obsolete. When this trust-based model migrates across contexts, additional costs surface. Environments with variable enforcement, informal power structures, or uneven accountability do not support ambient trust. Yet individuals conditioned within high-trust systems may carry the same interpretive assumptions into these settings. Here, self-protection is not merely underutilized, it is actively inhibited by identity. To become guarded feels regressive, even unethical. The individual remains exposed not because they lack awareness, but because defense conflicts with their understanding of what trust signifies. This creates a paradox. The more deeply trust is internalized as virtue, the more difficult it becomes to recalibrate when conditions change. Protection, once relinquished, is not easily reactivated without identity disruption. The critical failure of this framework lies in its assumption of continuity. Ambient trust depends on stable enforcement, shared norms, and predictable consequences. When transferred outside these conditions, it loses coherence. Historically, periods of institutional reliability are often followed by fragmentation. Yet the psychological posture cultivated during stability does not dissolve at the same pace. Trust outlives the structures that sustained it. Modern audiences frequently misapply this framework by universalizing it, treating trust as a timeless moral upgrade rather than a context-bound adaptation. In doing so, they overlook the conditions that once justified reduced self-protection. This is not a warning. It is an observation of mismatch. The framework fails not because it is false, but because it is incomplete, it accounts for cooperation under stability, but not for recalibration under drift. When protection is externalized for too long, internal mechanisms do not merely weaken, they become conceptually inaccessible. Defense is no longer understood as a neutral function, but as a violation of assumed order. At this point, the failure is not situational. It is interpretive. Trust, once embedded deeply enough, alters what protection means. It reframes vigilance as unnecessary noise and boundaries as friction. When conditions remain aligned, this reframing feels invisible. When they change, the absence it created becomes difficult to name. What remains unsettled is not whether trust was misplaced, but whether self-protection can be reintroduced without undoing the identity built in its absence. The cost of trust, in this form, is not exposure alone, but the uncertainty of whether defense can return without destabilizing the self that learned to live without it. The file remains open.